It's a great pleasure to introduce you to the latest Institute for Applied Ethics seminar. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you Dr Brauer, who has a day job at the university, but this is not his day job. This is definitely his moonlighting job, and may indeed be critical to aspects of his day job. I'll leave you to explain your day job if you wish. The title you have there, so Research Impact, Ethics and Academic Integrity, that covers quite a lot. I'm very intrigued to know what you're going to say. Just one thought. I mentioned earlier on the biscuits and the jam. We will be having at the end tea and coffee just outside here. So if you don't want the biscuits now, you're going to have them with your tea later. But while you ponder that, Rene, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello everyone. Just to let you know that I'm recording the presentation for future reference, but we won't record the Q&A section. I will be reading primarily of my notes, and the reason for that is that the issue of contention I'm raising is highly complex, controversial, and very critical. I've read out this presentation more times I care to admit, and as such I can inform you that I always come to roughly like 40 minutes for my 30 slides. For everyone that doesn't know me, my name is Rene, and I wrote my PhD thesis on research impact. And today I represent the Bacchus Institute of Science. We have provided complimentary biscuits, as you already mentioned, and the Bacchus blackberry jam to make this experience memorable for you. The aim of this talk is to untangle the ethical issues and implications for academic integrity within a research impact context. Also, let me be clear, I'm not here to point fingers. I'm doing all of this because I'm concerned about contemporary trends within the university and society at large. I hope during my presentation it will become clear which these are. For this presentation, I'm using a range of personal experience and informal observations so that I can manifest the problems that I see. By the very nature of discussing ethics, it relates to sensitive and very challenging topics. As such, I'm using personal examples. Yes, I'm simplifying, but I'm attempting to describe general trends that stretch far wider than just one single university or one academic experience. As such, if your comment is that a slide, argument, claim was too generalized, offensive, or inappropriate, yes, I'm fully aware of that possibility, as it's very difficult to cram this much complexity in a linear story that is coherent from beginning to end. Nevertheless, this is the entire point of having the discussion here at the Institute of Applied Ethics. Namely, concepts like morals, ethics, respect, integrity only matter when there's something at stake. And if it was not difficult and without risk, there wouldn't be a need for this very seminar. If you want to have some specific point elaborated, I've included numbers on every slide and provided specific references so you can make a note and ask me in the Q&A section, or just send me an email afterwards. So let's come to what is the Bacchus Institute of Science, which in essence is just me putting a fancy name on my research impact activities. Hello Terry. Of where I am in my own conduct test the limits of the research ecosystem. One of the issues that I see with utilizing research impact as an evaluation requirement is a question that I've been pondering for my own conduct. Namely, how do you whistleblow in an environment where the majority of your community has normalized your perceived point of contention and regards this as business as usual and as unproblematic? This presentation and the ideas I will be articulating is my very answer that I came up with. My hope is that I can make people realize that these very problems that I'm describing have systemic nature and stretch beyond any single individual's fault. The thesis that I'm developing is that proper socialization takes time, and when done improperly, a system collapse can ensue. My problem description also acknowledged that direct influence on academic integrity in relation to originality and innovation. According to Feyerabend, the progress of science, of good science, depends on novel ideas and on intellectual freedom. Science has very often been advanced by outsiders. Remember that Bohr and Einstein regarded themselves as outsiders. Nevertheless, what I think most radical philosophers of science / dissidents, who are also the future innovators, are missing due to their own position of being the radical in the moment, is the very value of orthodoxy. Without the reference for some convention, we can forget the whole notion of communication, as this is what language, words and concepts are, namely conventions. The issue is sorting out which conventions are in need of updating and which are not. Let me be clear, I don't think that I have the final answer. Quite the contrary, I'm doing all of this here because I don't know what else to do. I suppose this is my roundabout way of asking for help and feedback in order to start a conversation. My intention is to thrust my understanding against the establishment whilst commenting upon all the challenges that arose to my own academic integrity within the process. From my own perspective, if I'm committing any sin here, it is to have the audacity to put all of the pieces of the puzzle back together and merely stand here and say, well, this is what looks to me. What do you guys think? I think that research impact, ethics, and academic are interactively linked, as we infer research influence upon society. Since coming to Hull, I found in my own conduct, if I operate from such a position of academic integrity, not only does rejection sting far less, but it also represents a valuable data point, as we all can't know what we don't know. Will this attempt at describing my problems that I see working, making people aware? Who knows? At least actively trying, being reflective, being resolute, but humble about my own conduct is what I understand integrity to be all about. The issue that arises from the outset is impossible for anyone to tell if the new encountered information was an improvement or a disruption. And hence me presenting my ideas here so that we can find it together. So far so good, but it's here where complexity rears its ugly little head. The central theoretical axiom, proposition, thesis, argument, problem formulation, whatever you want to call it, that I'm raising here is that the categorical imperative has an epistemological dimension. And it's this ethical implication for research impact that is violated by the very end-focused assessment structure and conduct of the universities themselves. Furthermore, neither can I identify a first cause or an easy scapegoat, as I don't think the problems that I'm addressing are of this very nature. My initial worries were, well, how the heck do I break down this presentation into manageable pieces? As in order to understand the implication of this argument, its impact, if you so will, you have to go beyond mere facts, beyond rationality, beyond good and evil, even beyond the very notion of what makes individuals and indeed human. So I will be using classical separation of Greek ethics just to give me some sort of structure for my problem description. They started with a strophe, then proceeded to an antistrophe, and finishing on an epode. And it's this tripod of separation that I will be using in my ode to the university. The reason for this lyrical inspiration is that at this high level of abstraction, contention and misunderstanding are inevitable and actually welcome, and this is a very dialogue that makes it dialectic. As such, in order to prepare the argument that I'm presenting here, I picked it about, I might as well invest the time and effort not to only make it understandable, but also entertaining and memorable. So, the strophe. Let's come to the strophe of research impact, describing the issue that I see with an end result focused assessment structure. Research impact as an idea has been around for a long time, but it was first concretized when it became part of the Pathways to Impact section in funding application in 2007. This was then further reified with including the notion in the assessment of the REF 2014 and 2021 respectively. My proposition is that this very focus on impact leads to a disconnect between our understanding of how research impact works and what type of behavior this very end-focused assessment engenders. If we read the REF impact guidelines carefully, we can see a recognition of the chaotic nature of research impact. When we look at the manifestation and the implementation of research impact, we can find a very different picture, where we can see that it simply and elegantly leads to impact. That this is a stark simplification of the actual causality of research impact is an understatement. Let me identify 5 major problems that I see for such a post hoc reconstruction that represents a linear presentation that are now being used as best examples of best practice. Firstly, research impact in action is a lot more chaotic and unpredictable, which makes post hoc accounts only partially usable as modes of actions. Secondly, the establishment of expertise and neat categories comes after the innovation process has succeeded. Thirdly, at the research edge within the innovation process, it's not immediately obvious if it was an innovation or disruption. Fourthly, new innovation can be disruptive to the status quo, which people have vested interests in. And lastly, the main subject of this very presentation, within such a state of flux, what research impact is beneficial or detrimental for society in the long run is far from obvious in the moment. As such, taking past results to make future decisions in deciding what is research quality can be subject to the law of unintended consequences. In short, the disciplinary enforced model has serious flaws, and these flaws are not necessarily in the assumptions, but rather in how this push for best practice and research impact is implemented in general. Let's pontificate on this aspect a bit more. Let me give you guys an example. In the many interviews I had with academics for this research, we could see a separation of different understandings of research impact, which stratified themselves according to how long an individual was in contact with academia. Early career researchers understood research impact in an implementation-based fashion. in that they had to follow some preordained schemata of A that leads to B, that leads to C. Remember the simplified linear understanding? They believed that. Mid-career researchers who had some personal experience of academia under their belt became indignant with the perceived arbitrary nature of the rules that were enforced. Meanwhile, late-career researchers viewed research impact much more in terms of value. In other words, what impact do we want? Such layering is like the child, early career researcher, who is copying the behavior of the grown-ups around them. The petulant teenager, mid-career researcher, who is annoyed by the restrictive social rules of their culture, and the adult, late-career researcher, who has accepted that some social rules have a purpose, but is aware of the potential problems and tries to mitigate these. As such, if a university's moral economy is too rule-bound, too restrictive, too boxed in by its own assessment standard, and has not the advancement of knowledge as its highest purpose, what you get is people that can be operating to all the rules of the system. They can think that they behave ethical from the individual perspective, but nonetheless violating the categorical imperative by the mere act of taking part. Issues that can arise from the outside, for the outsiders who do not yet understand all the explicit and implicit rules of the game, is that they're totally ignorant to what rules have been transgressed if there's no communication, which ultimately can lead to frustration and potentially antagonism, if no mechanism of conflict resolution exists. Furthermore, the perceived need to act now before it's too late then inadvertently justifies antagonizing any means which potentially might contradict the stated end. Such a state of affairs for the insider justifies exclusion and under the pretense of moderation, and for the outsider it facilitates antagonism, as they're only faced with rejection and denied opportunities to learn and grow. Let me give you guys an example of my own research impact in action and the potential ethical problems that can ensue, especially focusing on this insider-outsider dynamic in relation to innovation and the harmony of the status quo, and how this relates to the perception of moderation and or censorship. When I finished my first draft for my PhD, I went onto an online forum that also focused on outcome-oriented goals, and there I posted all of my ideas that I developed in my PhD, in order to let others pick them apart and have a genuine peer review. Well, long story short, after 2 stints on that particular online forum, I was banned for spamming, and my input was perceived as a disruption of the harmony of the status quo. Because that's what innovation can be in the moment of discovery. It can be annoying because, well, we want to get things done. What I initially did in order to retain my own integrity was that I offered them to help write up their grievance in an academic article, articulating it to all the rules of the game with the promise that this will get published, which was met with ridicule and derision. In such a situation where fundamental axioms of rationality, ideology, and incentive structures clash, just saying be nice doesn't really resolve such issues, especially when it's the case where our own actions are causing unintended consequences. Furthermore, shooting the messenger then merely sweeps such issues under the carpet, leaving them unresolved, only to re-emerge later with even more ferocity. That school project that they were referring to, so flippantly, was me taking over 500 comments that amounted to in total 75,000 words, it left in the course of a 2 weeks conversation and analyzing them for their internal behavior dynamics, pointing out that what these do for the collectively produced knowledge of this epistemic community. Yet the very suggestion that their own behavior may have unintended negative consequences wasn't perceived as an attack of the group, of the harmony of the group. I even wrote a first draft and invited them to contribute with the promise that this article will get published and they will have their names associated to it, to which I was ridiculed and laughed at again, that this is impossible and nobody in the establishment will ever listen to it, and who do I think I am? Well, they were correct. It was impossible at the time, but several years and a lot of work later it's not anymore. Because here I am having a presentation for you guys at the university, articulating these very discussed grievances and doing the very thing I was told is impossible. That's the problem with judging things by parameters of the present. The unthinkable is always impossible until someone does it. Only post hoc is it possible to explain the causality, yet we all still need to act in the moment of uncertainty. Hence why the issue I'm raising here is not a rational problem, but an ethical one. Let me just be clear, I don't harbor any hard feelings against these individuals, quite the contrary. I regard this harsh treatment as a useful learning experience, and I much rather get banned on an online forum for my ideas than be crucified in real life to find out if they have any merit or not. However, there's a more serious point here, as it pertains to our very human nature and what roles universities fulfill in society. In case people didn't know, the very name of a university derives from the guilds of scholares, which is Latin for learned men, that sought papal approval to teach, meaning the Universitatis Magisterium et Scholarum, in other words, the community of teachers and scholars. For all my talk about academic integrity, the individual who bans me still thinks of me as a disruption. Or most probable, they don't even think of me at all. In the sense that in their position of authority, limited as it may was, I was a disruption to the status quo, a nuisance if you so will, and hence why I was removed from the collective discussion. But that's the issue, in the sense that from the position of authority, such conduct is seen as moderation. Meanwhile, from the position of the condemned, it's seen as censorship of intellectual freedom. These two outcomes are not two different processes, but rather the difference comes in where in relation to the decision the individual is located. What will happen to me after this presentation? Well, we'll see what the questions come. In this section, I want to now explore the interface between universities and societies in large, in what research impact they have, if you so will, as well as the emergent issue with the difference of interpretation between the outsider and the insider. In other words, let's focus on the ethical dimension of why the research impact agenda can generate ethical problems. Based on my own reading and research, I was able to subdivide the understanding of what universities are for into three different categories. The first being a commitment to the advancement of knowledge, which can be seen as a reincarnation of the religious history of the university. Here, the purpose of a university is to tend the spiritual and the moral character of society, to borrow Wilhelm von Humboldt's words. Secondly, we can identify a social contract view, which sees the primary purpose of a university to aid and support the betterment of society. Such a view is, for example, advocated by funding bodies with their focus on research impact. Last but not least, we also have what I call the neoliberal view, which represents the view that universities are forced to provide efficient workforce for industry and the individuals themselves so that they can get degrees which allows them to have high-paying jobs. This is something that's, for example, used by marketing to get new students and investors, for example. The reason of why this is necessary to outline is the different ideological views is dependent on if my subsequent narration will be understood as a genuine problem, me scaremongering, or what I'm describing is actually desired. Part of my argument is a very simple equation, and it goes something like this. Universities have steadily increased their student numbers and fees, as well as taking on more and more tasks they fulfill. The biggest complaint from academics is that they're being swamped and the time for research is squeezed out. And then we have students who are already entering universities with bad working habits due to a failing school system or personal problems at home. So here are now overworked academics that are supposed to train and culture students into a highly sophisticated research process that takes both time and effort, something which they increasingly don't have. Yet we can see a number of first degrees steadily going up, leading to an inflation of the value of these very degrees. The simple question is not only where future innovation is going to come from, but also what impact such a system is creating in its own right. For all practical sense and purposes, we are living in a scientific culture right now, where the socialization process to acquire scientific rationality is long and difficult, but more about that later. Nevertheless, from the top of my head, I could mention the crisis in replicability, the grievance studies affair, issues about post-truth, or increased social tension, as all part of the consequences of this failure of societal-wide socialization that I'm referring to. The issue is, I can't blame to a single individual, nor claim that the detrimental consequences I see are due to malice, as it appears to me to be an unintended consequence of a very cultural organization that focuses on end results and not process. Proper education takes time and effort, both on the time of the educator and the student. The reason for that is that we're all individuals and as such need a tailor-made approach to not only kindle the flame of self-learning in us, but also impart the wisdom of how to maintain your integrity, when to yield or push, and the need to keep your own demons in check. Let's come back to the value of socializing the outsider and the young, as well as what benefits and risks exist for them in the innovation process. With individuals like Alan Turing, it's quite evident what enormous benefits he had upon society in terms of research impact. Yet regardless, the status quo of the time still treated him unpleasant. Similarly, I would also proposition that Foucault's very homosexuality, that was deemed the collective sexual persona non grata at the time, allowed him many of his insights about discipline and power. Thereby the whole causality of socialization and how it relates to research impact that I'm referring to is neatly summarized in the idea of role modeling. But if the role model is shirking their responsibility, does as little work as possible, and only cares about their own career advancement, was ridiculing and antagonizing other individuals as weird, stupid, ignorant, inefficient, or hateful, why are we surprised when subsequent generations exactly manifest this type of behavior. Don't we reap what we sow? Sorry. Today, the sexual persona non grata is no longer homosexuality, and the individuals discussing their experience have a different biological predisposition. Thereby, what is being extrapolated in theoretical worldviews takes a different form. I suspect that the growing generation of Western men can observe their own value system being violated, yet they lack the sophistication in articulating their point of contention other than to mock it. The problem that arises is such mockery is then taken at face value by the others who do not share the same implicit values and labeling it as hate. Meanwhile, from the people who make this mockery, they lambast the people who don't get it as people who can't take a joke and have no sense of humor in order to explain this failure of communication. The internet is probably the most tangible manifestation of what tone unmoderated human intellectual exchange has. I would say that the internet as an everyday technology has completely shattered any notions about civility of discourse being the normal state of human conflict resolution. Rather, the complete shit show that is online discourse is reflective of human-to-human sentiments. Granted, online anonymity exacerbates such vitriol, as there is no immediate social repercussions for such behavior. However, from my understanding, such a state of affairs is not an indictment against anonymity, but rather a testimonial of just how important our rules of discourse are in contentious social situations. For example, anonymity with the outgroup, meaning someone who doesn't share my value assumption, is our normal state of affairs, as all I know is that, well, it's not one of us. I know we have this whole idea of personal responsibility, and I am by no means advocating against it. However, if we have an entire generation of men failing to surpass their fathers in terms of income, relationship success, educational achievement, and so forth, at what point are we allowed to look at the system and ask how this research impact has been emanating from the universities? And no such line of questioning is not racist, sexist, homophobic, misogynistic, or whatever label is usually used to shut down questions of integrity, as this is a very unintended research impact of these labels and their underpinning research. Sure, this may not have been the intention, but that's the end result. When our current generation of boys grows up, and we will have a second generation of men that are now doing worse than their fathers, thereby the whole discourse of white male privilege is going to start to wear a bit thin on the ground and be not reflective of these men's lived experience. Nor will it represent a useful tool to moderate their pride. Neither will it be a good incentive for them to participate in a system that they deem as actively hostile towards them. The reason of why I'm utilizing this dynamic as an example is merely because it represents an area of knowledge that I'm familiar with. But the point that I'm trying to make is applicable to all sorts of research impact activities. When research impact is being discussed within a university or ref context, it's always implied that research has a beneficial impact upon society. However, logically, there's nothing precluding research to have a detrimental impact upon society, because benefit to whom? One of the detrimental research impact that I'm referring to is a mechanism that has resulted in that young, white, heterosexual working class males are now being the worst performing demographic within the UK and the Western world in general. And even implying that there is something wrong with the gender dynamics can get you fired, Nobel Prize or not, as Tersim Hunt found out the hard way. Whose research impact can we thank for that? What is interesting historically is that it's precisely such troublemakers, regardless of race, sexuality, or social class, that were disenfranchised and mistreated in the moment, who become the locus of new revolutionary ideas. The will of the individual to endure such punishment and failure, yet continue regardless, is what becomes the engine of their success. However, this doesn't tell us anything about the content of the ideas in question. Neither does it tell us anything about the necessary consideration of how academics promote beneficial research impact in order to retain their own academic integrity. I see academic integrity and research impact as inherently connected, in that if the rejection becomes too grueling, too punishing, and the bar for entry becomes too steep and doesn't allow for the young to make mistakes, to learn and grow over time, at what point have we created a filtering mechanism that now no longer selects for people that want to have a good faith discussion, but rather selects for socio or psychopaths that willingly take this punishment in the pursuit of their own goals? And how do we tell the difference? Yes, I'm using my own idiosyncratic experience to showcase how innovation is born, namely in that the weathering such antagonism and not letting your pride consume you, which on both sides of the argument allows progress to be born. However, there's only this much one side of the argument can do when there is no reciprocation. Yes, the individual can offer some more, However, at what point does this endless sacrifice of the individual turn into exploitation? This reflection will now occupy the last part of the presentation. As such, let's think a little bit about academic integrity. Here I will be contrasting different conceptualization of what it means to be rational and how this interrelates to ethics, finishing on a note about integrity and the value of truth. Akin to the difference in competing ideological understanding, the here raised argument only makes sense if you depart from a similar understanding of how the so-called scientific rationality arises in the first place. Here we can also subdivide it into three different conceptualizations. These are a modernistic understanding, which sees humans as universally rational that can hash out differences with reasoned debate, evidence, and argumentation. A postmodern understanding that states that humans are intrinsically motivated by power and are merely using their social standings in order to further their own power position. And finally, a postmodern perspective where your particular cohort has to first depart from similar value assumptions that are encultured into them for them to even have the ability to find agreement. From a postmodern perspective, scientific rationality is a precious gift that is being handed down to us from our predecessors, and it's our own obligation to continue enculturing this very rationality so that the next generation doesn't have to repeat the same mistakes of the past. I took this phrase walk the talk from a book called Rethinking Expertise from Harry Collins and Robert Evans. From such an understanding, scientific rationality represents a form of learned connoisseurship that encultures expertise into the norms and values of the aspiring scientist. This is the way that I conceptualize academic integrity to be, in that your action meet your words. Now that doesn't change that I can be stupid sometimes, make mistakes, and can be perceived as irrational, whatever that now means. But there's one thing that nobody can say to me, and that is you lied to me. You wouldn't believe how much difficult, if not impossible, a dialectic is with someone who lies, and how much effort needs to be wasted to sort out if there are or not. My examples of my stint on the online forums was basically me trying to exemplify the associated issues that occur in an atavistic intellectual environment, meaning in the type of environment that the researchers are expected to engage with in order to enact their own research impact, as people most likely will not a priori agree to all of the assumption of the respective research. However, what determines what is right or true is not just a dominant power position. If this would be the case, then the whole idea of peace would be nonsensical. All social rules represent a compromise between allowing certain aspects of our biology to manifest while curbing other propensities that are deemed as harmful to the well-being of the group. Here, men and women traditionally had different gender roles within society, and it's only recently that we've changed our social mores in taking away the separation. Obviously, such change have been implemented under the pretense of social justice and care for the other, and there were legitimate reasons for that. However, just as past social rules have had unintended consequences, so can our contemporary social organization. Let's raise the level of abstraction again and not only look at individual socialization, but cultures in general. The idea of the noosphere is an extension of the concept of the biosphere, but instead of living organism, what is being referred to is the realm of human knowledge, world of forms, as Plato would have referred to it. As the environment is ever-changing and the human mind as part of that environment cannot handle overbearing complexity, hence we humans create categories to reduce that complexity, interlinking them with other categories that subsequently in their totality represent our worldviews. If such frameworks of understanding then get materially reinforced in buildings, education systems, and reward and punishment system, we can then speak of cultures. From such a viewpoint, we can see universities as city-states that are fighting each other in an internal battle in the noosphere. Here the citizens, in other words the members of the university, now allocate prestige to whomever is best equipped to generate resources from the environment via the means of words and not violence, whilst inculturing the next generation in the process. However, what is more important, how we do it or what impact do we have? The problem that arises with following the assumptions of today and not adjusting for future information is that then there is no distinction between violence violence and dialogue as a means of conflict resolution. From the perspective of the dominant force, they self-evidently conceptualize their conduct as justified. From the perspective of the innovator/usurper, this difference actually matters a lot in that being ridiculed may hurt one's ego, but being silenced with force may be potentially lethal. The great insight of any religious system is that such individual sacrifice for the betterment of the collective and the resulting cooperation is the basis of any tribe or high culture. as regardless of how physically strong or able any individual is, they will always be outperformed by cooperation of several individuals acting in a group. To summarize, the pen is indeed mightier than the sword as a collective which in a civilized way constantly updates its frameworks of understanding, not only adjusts to an ever-changing environment, but also can find innovative ways that allows conflict to be resolved via consensus and innovation instead of force. Thereby the duty to invest and nurture the young and the other via dialogue is not only the very foundation of Western civilization, but also the very reasons for its historic success, for better or worse, I suppose. Put in Kantian terms, such an ethos represents a perfect duty from which there is no exception. It's on this civilizational development level where we see the social rules as a mediation of unconscious male and female sexual urges. Such a reverence for logos, which is Greek for the word, and refers to the order of knowledge and represents the root of ideas about logic, which according to Karl Popper represents the very essence of Western civilization. Furthermore, it is in this duet between the old and the young master singers, to borrow Wagner's metaphor, where the collective inspiration and progress is born. Although individually such a dynamic can give rise to the birth of tragedy, when completely incommensurable biological imperatives and other immediate concerns of the moment clash. Historically, we can trace the impact of such collective of disenfranchised men that found each other and explored ideas together to make sense of their shared grievances. For example, in the 17th century, we had the Republic of Letters. In the 18th century, we had the penny universities. In the 19th centuries, we had the formation of the German Burschenschaften that popped up in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, all culminating what in German was called the Kulturkampf after Bismarck unified Germany by blood and iron, which was a battle predominantly over the control of educational and ecclesiastical appointments. All of these conflicts in epistemic communities contributed today that we find ourselves at the precipice of history. Today we're living the research impact of this world. Nowadays we have a culture war and talking about post-truth society. It's the same old civilizational dance it always has been. For example, the internet for all its ills has provided a safe haven for these poor souls that have all of their problems and struggles ridiculed. Let me read you a quote from someone I had a conversation with within these chat rooms. One thing is that I want to add is that I don't think that they're actually against white males due to them only being the other, but also because what Logos is, namely the collective spirit that built and maintained Western society over time, which they call the patriarchy and see as a male-only construct, because they believe that only men are responsible for creating the society they live in, thereby revoking any form of responsibility on their part. They can only see the male unconsciousness as a terrible father, because their hubris shields them from their own inner terrible mother, which makes sense. Who wants to admit that there's a monster inside of them? Same on the red pill side. It's the Jungian shadow, which most have completely cut off. They are just a walking ego that is fed either by their anima, animus, or persona, making them rather shallow and conformist to groupthink. This could probably still be a remaining generational trauma from what happened in the 21st century. Academic integrity is what I understand to be everything that allows you not to succumb to groupthink. Rather, consensus is reached through an intellectual sparring, which indeed can be triggering. Yes, this is a value judgment, but it has a technical implication, namely that the only alternative to means of conflict resolution is then by force or deceit. My described characterization is not dismissing the criticism of postmodernism, rather it investigates and inquires about the positive function of any social construction for enabling cooperation in the first place. Quite rightly, Western culture system can be criticized for being exclusionary and hence its fracturing based on unequal distribution of resources. However, if the individual in the position of authority are squashing dissent to create a too inflexible system under the pretense of stability, excellence, equality, compassion, climate change, or indeed impact, whatever idol is elevated as a justification, it will be usurped eventually as any other system has throughout human history, as this contradiction multiplies so much that it will become untenable. Updating the systems through the word is the research impact of my own research that I strive for. The very fact that I was allowed to articulate these ideas here is an indication for me that there is something to have truth as my highest moral value in order to retain my own research integrity. The very idea of scientific truth compels one for dialogue and humility that allows for conflict resolutions without the means of violence. Yes, it's socially constructed. Yes, it could be different, but there are very good reasons of why social rules ended up the way that they did, as otherwise the whole notion of a community becomes meaningless, as well as the very idea of a community of scholars and teachers, in other words, a university. What makes this leap of logic that I'm presenting here so difficult to follow is that on paper we can see people are getting more and more degrees, wonderful research impact and so forth. But if you break down this into individual demographics, we can see men failing educationally. If the genders would be reversed, if it would be any other socially approved demographic that is okay to have sympathy for, what I've described would be regarded as a travesty. The type of socialization that I'm referring to is a never-ending process of cultural development. And I honestly can't say when this disregard for male sacrifice started. Maybe it's been always there to some extent. Nevertheless, as the violation of the categorical imperative happens on such a high level of abstraction, I think the very negative consequences are not even intended, which usually allows the establishment to dismiss such questions regarding academic integrity as either a conspiracy theory or based on ad hominem attacks on the very messenger articulating such issues. Thereby the impact agenda as a whole may be contributing to the societal-wide trend. So yeah, here's a short selection of other relevant lecture that I'm building on for this presentation in case you're interested. If you want me to share the article draft where I'm articulating all of that or the PowerPoint presentation, just send me an email. So yeah, let me say thank you for listening through that. It was really complex and I tried to get all of that through. So are there any questions?
Well, thank you very much, Rene. You're committed to dialogue?
Yes.
Okay, let's start dialogue.
Even I just monologued away for 40 minutes.
Well, we're going to segue from one. So let's do that before we have tea and coffee.
Absolutely.
So any comments, questions, thoughts, oppositions, challenges, underminings, whatever.
Well, we're here. So there seems to be some individuals that have a commitment to community, but from my understanding, this seems to be a minority. So, and that then gets consequences in what type of behavior is being taught to the next generation, because that is apparently that behavior that is conducive in that environment to get successful. So, and if that community behavior is not individually successful, then you can get tensions. But this is the thing, it's like, how do you define corruption? Do you define corruption based on like questionable practices? Well, if it's questionable practices, you have a framework where you're saying, well, this is how you should do it correctly. Well, the academics are sitting on the ref panel, they're setting the rules for themselves. So it's like, well, where do you start? But it's still engendering this very focus where the working requirement just goes up the entire time. So it's a system that is self-perpetuating itself and basically creating even more and more measures because that's what's measurable. And then everybody complains about that politics is a 4-year window. Well, universities now have a 7-year window. Congratulations, you're 3 years more ahead. So. And that's basically what I was talking about and having this whole introduction, because I think it's an unintended consequence in the sense of like these activities are being implemented based on ideas about transparency and about accountability and all of these things, but then they can create unintended consequences where then everything becomes measurable, then people look at it and they're like, oh, you're not productive, please do some more. Well, it's not a different process. These are the same thing, you know. In one dimension it's great, but in the other one it creates unintended consequences. So because these rules change all the time, research impact just came in 2007 and now it's 2021. Now the research impact templates and sections are removed from funding applications, but now the expectation is, well, now it's an automatic part of the entire funding application, as if that always has been the case. So it's the rules of how the academic game and how that works are changing constantly. So it's an ever-shifting field, And in that shifting field, people are being now encultured in. But if the people that are on top are talking from a different environment that was that was the case 20 years ago and is no longer today, and there's a disconnect in the communication, and that showed itself in the, like I was saying, when I looked at the different ages in terms of how much contact an individual had with academia and how they understood what this activity of impact was supposed to be about. It's it is now introduced as an official evaluating criteria, in the sense of like it's expected that academics have impact. And by that expectation, the impact that academics can have tailors itself to those 7-year time windows of the ref. So if you're not impactful, as according to the definitions, within that time frame window, then there is associated internal position of who ranks, who goes up in the hierarchy and who goes down in the hierarchy. So it's how the system of how it's being measured is influencing the very academic community. So the most of the grievances that are resulting from where academics are indignant about their workload or get competing priorities comes from these external evaluations of research. So it's how they can be made, quote unquote, better to not squash innovation. Well, that's the conversation that I want to have. Yes, it's not a critique so much of the very research impact as an activity. It's about how it is measured and what type of behavior that engenders of that measurement. Because it comes probably from a good place, you know, making universities more accountable and use of public funds and all of these things. But then when it becomes to actually like accounting for the impact in terms of impact case studies or in terms of affiliating your research to social concerns that are accepted right now. Well, what about social concerns that are not accepted right now? Can you have an impact case study that is critical of the government and basically make a good claim? Who's going to write? Who's going to sign those testimonials that you have influenced them by not doing something that they would like to have done? So it's difficult because the whole notion of impact comes with a value judgment. Do we like that impact or don't we like that impact? So the people making those judgments, that matters. Well, that's basically the rate of questionable research practices, and based on internal, like the workload that universities are getting, that journal editors are getting, and the volume that is being sent to them. So, from those types of considerations and literature, they're always saying, oh, there is no more groundbreaking research. So the question is like, well, why is that happening? So it's trying to make sense of the actual discussions that is going on within the journal editors and their workload complaints, where they're getting more and more volume in terms of research papers and stuff, but in terms of actual quality of what change book that makes, the discussions is then usually not a lot. So it's basically the disciplines that I look at, they have these types of discussions. Well, that's basically it's exactly as you stated, in the sense of like that impact is the very tip of the iceberg of that, because an impact is explicit. This focus on the end result, focus on what difference you make, but that's the entire process of drawing up metrics and doing it measurable in terms of income, in terms of publication numbers, in terms of conference attendance, and all of these things. Everything is just getting higher and higher, and impact is just, well, we want to change the world today. If you're going to make a great impact case study and you showcase that, you get QR funding from the government back. So it plays into this entire like metric focused end result aspect of it. And that's a really good question, because yes and no. I don't think it has been different in the sense of like that the universities always had to fight for their survival. They always had to lobby for funds. More minor differentiation. But what I also would say is there's a difference in size. It's a lot more people that are doing doing like research and so forth, and maybe that is not appropriate. Not appropriate. It's not comparable to the amount of funds that are available. Hence, why that the competition goes up. So maybe the perception of that it's worse than it's ever been is because the competition is now more than it used to be. So I don't know, but I think there's elements there which have always been like that, but then there's also new particular challenges in the sense of like where the rules explicitly are being changed, like for the for example, the introduction of these impact case studies, which did not exist before 2014, and now it's like, yes, it's been always there, we've always done that type of thing, so it's complex. Exactly. I just recently read a paper that looked at the discourse of higher education and how it changed in Finland over a 10-year period of where they implemented these end-focused in 2010. And it was just as you'd explained, where it became from a recognition of the more subdued influence that the universities have on society in terms of like training rational thinking, training appreciation for the arts and all that, which was completely changed in that period to like, we want to have world-leading research, we want to have patents, that we want to have research that is good for the economy. So it shifted from that, and that was disregarded if it was a right-wing government or a left-wing government. And the speculation that was made in the paper was that is also because those, like you were saying, those metrics become self-perpetuating because they're there, and then we use them to make judgments because it's convenient to make those types of judgments. Yeah? Come back to the, like I was saying, the value judgment, the value dimension in the impact discourse and logic, because once you're talking about it, you've made an impact upon society. Okay, says who? How is that defined? Who makes these judgments? And if those judgments that you're saying goes against the agendas or like ambitions of these individuals, well then you think, no, I don't want to be engaged with that type of thing. He made that either because it's critical, it doesn't, is opportune to them. So that creates a whole range of ethical negotiations that the researchers now have to navigate, which they probably previously didn't have to the same degree. So it's, and that is mandated from the very way of how these impact case studies are designed. It's not like they didn't want that as a that to happen in a sense of like, oh, we want to put researchers in a tough position. No, because if you're going to measure something, you have to go out there and get those measurements. So then you're going to have an effect on that. So it's like, well, now you're in a position of having to transverse all of these value systems that exist in politics or that exist in the industry, and having to navigate those things which the researcher may not be privy to, and then they can put themselves into jeopardizing position, which previously the academic like hierarchy, the leadership didn't have to do to that same degree. So now they can say, oh, don't worry about it, it's not that difficult. Well, yeah, it wasn't 20 years ago, but now it is. So it's also a generational aspect to that. Because if you never are in that position where you face those problems, it's not a problem. And the hijacking, or if you want to call that, here is coming back to this whole unintended consequences, may not be very like ill-intentioned or have any nefarious aspects, because maybe it's just trivial in terms of workload, in the sense of like you have to present a very crisp story of impact on 5 pages because those poor evaluators on the ref have to read 50 of these. it's just an operational requirement, but that operational requirement then engenders this type of behavior where now the academics have to spend I don't know how many hours basically filling out these funding applications, because that's what they in essence are. They're funding applications to the government, taking in a different form. Coming back to the whole, like, if it was ever any different, what if all of those people that we remember now, quoting like this wonderful Nietzsche or like all of the Merton or what if these were people that were rule breakers in the moment and we only remember them because they broke the rules of their particular systems, which made them famous. So now we have a different system that is putting people into different boxes, and the innovation comes from going against some of these rules from the system, and those rules change. And today we have those rules with impact and have sustainability. All of these things need to be planned in, which then shapes the research landscape in certain ways. And we could take a favorable view of that and saying, well, you know, there were people that find breaks, find workarounds to those rules, and in 50 years' time, those people will be remembered, and impact will be a different a memory in people's like heads. So how that's going to happen in 50 years, I don't know. So it can be positive development as well, because now it allows us to have these conversations as I'm doing now here, articulating things which previously could not be articulated maybe. And now this engenders conversations where the academic community as a whole can be more self-reflective and then find better ways and then rinse and repeat as a cultural propagation process over time. So it's maybe it's our current year annoyance. That's what I'm trying to say. And then we find something else to be annoyed about in 10 years' time. So. What I was saying, system collapse, you know, it can happen because you can have, like I was saying, unintended consequences of where the individuals that are successful in that game become the ones that have had the longest engagement with it. They have the most impact. Well, yes, these are now being rewarded, but these are not the new ones that are in 20 years' time. So it's like it's a difficult question because it stretches so far in terms of like how long these cycles take for innovation to be implemented. Yeah, maybe the whole finding innovation and complaining, maybe not complaining is the right word, but being annoyed about the contemporary confines of the status quo and finding workarounds and then publishing those as new research findings. That's how the system innovates itself, and then that goes over time, and then we remember the people that were the big innovators that found workarounds for something which we all annoyed by. You know? That's the thing, and the here is now the counter argument to that is what makes Hull not unique? if we have the further one and I'm the lonely prophet one, and then it's like this is what then it's like here it now happened to have this conversation, and in other aspects it doesn't happen because nobody stood up and talked about it as a problem, because everybody was annoyed by it, but they got on with it regardlessly, and nobody ever stood up and was like, well, can we actually think about this type of thing? So it's I agree with you that it's definitely not a doom and gloom, like everything is forlorn type of situation, but it's a projection of a trend, and if that trend continues as it is now, then I think we have problems that are anticipated. Very much. This is where it becomes kind of like a honey trap in the sense of like where these metrics, if you're doing well on them, well, why would you be critical against them? It's like, this is good for you. It's like you get career advancement and you publish in the right journal and that's fantastic. You get a clap on the back and then you behave like everybody else and voila, you've created groupthink of an entire like system because everybody's behaving in the exact same way. That's maybe pertaining to that I was special. But I know what you mean in the sense of like the incentive structure can create perverse incentives for conduct which is not conducive to either community or good research practice. So, and that's an issue that I think is something worth looking at and trying to find out how that applies for every individual academic for their research, because guess what? If you're going to have research impact, those problems are coming your way. Because there's no running away from them if you're going to influence other people with it. So.
And I'd like to thank you for the thought of the paraversity too. The Institute of Applied Ethics is, I know, but non-related based it. And the Institute of Applied Ethics is the paraversity to this university. So let's go with that thought. And let's also thank Rene very much for his interesting talk today and for the conversation that followed from it. Thanks very much.